So I wanted to find out how I could play like James Jamerson or how to sound like James Jamerson. But there are so many articles and videos already on that stuff. So I thought maybe the best thing would be to find an example of his playing and then microanalyze about why it sounds so great. And I thought, yeah, that's a good idea. And it wasn't a super difficult thing to find samples of his playing because there are a few isolated bass tracks of James Jamerson floating around on the internet. But I chose What's Going On by Marvin Gaye because I love that track. I got hold of the tracks, put them into my recording software so I could see,
oh, what's going on? Right on, baby.
Oh yeah, and when he recorded it, he was drunk. Like seriously, he was drunk.
What?
And I'll talk about that later. So today I've come up with 4 questions. I'm going to call them the Jamerson questions. And they're questions that you can ask yourself about when you're playing, about whether your playing is Jamerson worthy. And I really think they're going to help you think about your playing in a different way. Let me know in the comments how you get on with answering the Jamerson questions about your playing. And please give the video a like if you find it helpful. Number 1, is each note that you play perfect? So the first thing that you can notice is that each note of his playing is perfect. When I teach privately, one thing I say to students is that you want each note to be like a drop of water. So they're all kind of coming down from different heights, but each one is perfectly formed. And when Jamerson is playing, each note does sound the same. Just to help you make a bit of sense about what these shapes mean, each bubble here represents a new note. So let's have a look at this one. The height of the note shows the volume, and you can see the height of every note in this little section is very similar, indicating that the volume of each note is similar. The length of each note represents the time that each note is played, and you can see that each note has a very similar tail, which means that the notes all end smoothly. And I'll go into this further throughout the video. Now, when you're first learning bass, or just when you're playing the bass at any level, it's kind of common to, like, as you're kind of finishing a note, to kind of get this kind of buzz. Because maybe you're not being aggressive enough for kind of finishing the note. Or maybe even your action on your bass needs to kind of change. But you really need to kind of work on your muting or your finger positioning to really make sure that when you're playing the notes, each one is perfectly formed and you haven't got this kind of like gritty part at the end. So if I'm just playing What's Going On, the bass line, when I played it, then I'm really trying to work on making sure that each note has the same kind of quality and consistency. Oh yeah, so I mentioned about Jamerson being drunk when he played this bass line. Apparently, Marvin Gaye had found Jamerson playing at a local club, brought him into the studio, and Jamerson was too drunk and tired to sit on a chair, so he lay on his back, and it's still perfect. Are you adding mud between notes? Now, one thing which is a really common tendency among beginners is to put these kind of slaps in between each beat to kind of keep the tempo. So if I was playing What's Going On with the slaps, what happens, it creates these extra sounds in a mix, whether that's a live recording or a studio recording, and it's really unnecessary and it kind of clogs things up. If you look at Jamerson's playing, there's none of that extra unnecessary sound between notes. Even this section here where there is a large gap, there is a little bit of sound you can see here in this bump, but that's just the sound of the other bits of the recording that have spilled into the bass recording. All the notes tail off perfectly, and there's not even string noise between the notes. Now, why is Jamerson such an important figure as a bassist? Why do we still talk about him almost 60 years after the tracks he played on were first released? Ain't No Mountain High Enough was released in 1967. For Once in My Life by Stevie Wonder was recorded in 1968. But I think that the reason that his playing is still so relevant is that Motown sound, which he was so fundamental in creating, is the fabric of what's modern Western pop music. You see his influences in Bruno Mars, Anderson .Paak, and more obviously in Amy Winehouse. So to understand his sound goes a long way to understanding the role of bass in modern pop music. And what I love about his bass lines are that even though his ability was like up here, some of his bass lines have a difficulty level of like down here. They're really easy to play. They're great for beginners because when he played those bass lines, they were the right bass lines for the song. He always put the song first. For example, Dancing in the Street by Martha and the Vandellas, which is like the easiest bass line in the world. It's like one string for like a lot of it, an open E. Does the tone of your playing sound full and smooth? It just feels nice listening to Jamerson's playing. His setup was super simple. He used a P bass with a sponge to dampen the strings and labella heavy gauge strings, which he never ever changed. He didn't even look after the bass. He was renowned for just kind of like bashing it about. On the Motown recordings, he didn't use a bass amp either. The bass was plugged straight into the desk via a DI that the studio created. And the ingenuity in these guys who worked in the studio creating all these things is incredibly impressive. You can get a similar preamp these days if you've got the... He also played with the level of his bass quite high, which introduced a slightly overdriven sound. And it kind of gives the notes a little bit of a thump. But regardless of how he went about the sound, listening to it just feels great. And there's something I'll point out which I think affects a lot of people's playing, is that when you hit a note on the higher strings, it can sound tonally different than the other strings. So it sounds a bit weird. So to demonstrate, if you kind of have a look at this section here, we kind of listen to Jamerson's playing. Now, a common way that would be played by a beginner or someone intermediate would be... So the top notes sound a bit kind of plucky and twangy. And these kind of things may seem like small things, but a bunch of notes like that accumulate to kind of this uneven sounding bass. One thing you can do to fix problems like this is to try and play notes on lower strings. But you can also need to work on getting your plucking fingers in a good position to play all notes on all strings evenly. So to demonstrate for this section. So I really had to kind of get into the meat of the note on those higher strings. Are you trying too much to play like a robot? In a modern pop song like this one here, the tempo tends to be the same all the way through. In this case, it's 94 beats per minute, which Apple's AI has worked out. But if you look at what Apple's AI has come up with for what's going on, you can see how the tempo changes quite a bit. It goes from 99 beats per minute to 99.6 beats per minute to 100 beats per minute, and this happens all the way through the track. It's crazy, it's kind of like all over the place, but doesn't feel like when you're listening to it that the music is out of time. Now, it's possible that over the last 50, 60 years, the tape which made these recordings has got a bit warped and created these kind of weird tempo changes. But regardless, even if that's the case, when you're listening to it, it doesn't feel like the song is going in and out of tempo. It just feels like it's flowing naturally. And that's because there's kind of humans playing with each other. According to Sound on Sound magazine, which is an excellent publication, by the way, the members of the Funk Brothers who played on the instrumental parts of the track were Chet Forrest on drums, Marvin Gaye played piano, Robert White played guitar, and James Jamerson played bass. Now, these are admittedly four guys who are beyond exceptional musicians, but they played together perfectly, and they played together perfectly because they play like musicians, not like robots. Now, for you at home playing by yourself, you kind of have to play to a kind of robotic metronome a lot, but I think the takeaway is that if you can find other musicians to play with, even if you're a beginner, seize the opportunity, because you'll improve your ability to play music immensely and not play like a robot. And also, playing with others is like the most fun thing in the world. And if you want printable PDFs or guitar profiles from today's lesson, they're available on my Patreon page. And a big thanks to all my patrons, especially my VIP patron, who's a legend.